Erosion is natural. It happens all the time. Lands are built up, lands erode down. It's happened over millions of years, billions of years. It's happening now, and it will continue to happen.
The one thing that stops water doing bad things is plant matter. You've got to get cover on that soil to slow the water down. And that means you've got to do two things. You've got to have enough plants in the ground so that the water that's on the ground doesn't move too fast in a straight line. And secondly, you've got to have enough plants in the ground so that the raindrops falling from the sky don't break the soil surface. And that physical break of the soil surface is absolutely detrimental. So it doesn't matter how good you think you are as a manager, if you have got bare soil at the start of the wet season, you are going to have some problems.
The main agents of soil erosion are water and wind. Water running down the face of a slope collects speed and small particles of soil, creating a sandblasting effect.
You got rain up in the cloud, and it's got potential energy. I don't know if you did physics, but that raindrop wants to get down to the ocean, and it's got energy built up in it. And as it goes down the ocean, it's dissipating that energy. The first thing it does is it crashes down the earth and hits the earth. Splash. That's the first bit of energy it loses, and it potentially does some damage when it hits the ground. And then it'll run across the ground, it'll go down, and as it goes down, it's losing energy as it goes, but potentially takes things with it. And our challenge is to get that water droplet and all its mates from the cloud to the ocean with the minimum of damage.
Erosion is a natural process, but it is accelerated by changes in land use and human pressure on the land.
Management is obviously a critical thing that we can change. If we've got cover, we'll protect the soil. If you've got about 70% cover of your land, you basically don't get sheet erosion. Below that, you're starting to get erosion between the grass, and it gets a lot worse as the cover drops.
Just a key point, as being a pastoralist, I hate bare ground. There's no return on it. It's pretty important. We keep good ground cover and the ground cover we want.
Grazing lands across northern Australia have been under pressure from past poor management practices. Broad-scale pasture rehabilitation and pasture improvement work in the NT was given a real boost with the decision to go ahead with the Ord River irrigation scheme in the 1960s. Large areas of pastoral land in the Ord River catchment were put under revegetation works throughout the 1960s and 70s. Following this was the 1980s BTEC scheme, which saw the removal of thousands of head of cattle. It was also a time of dry years that left overutilised areas crying out for attention.
The thing with rehabilitation is that it is quite case specific. It's absolutely impossible for me to stand up here and say this is how you control erosion everywhere. Each case is case specific.
With good seasons throughout the late 1990s, the rehabilitation equipment was parked up and researchers, pastoral staff and technical staff retired or moved on. This production has been compiled to display and compare rehabilitation techniques and to emphasise the correct method of use for various implements. Only by being able to fully appreciate and compare these rehabilitation techniques can we truly understand the correct methods required for the control of sheet erosion.
The opposed disc plough, in all its various forms, was still basically a 3-point leakage implement with the big double discs, depending on the hardness of the soil, just how well they bit in. And these discs were predominantly about 36 inch and in a V system that threw this loose soil in a ridge in the behind the discs. The discs revolved, and depending on the hardness of the soil, just how deep they bit in. In this case here, in this soil, they're biting a bit over 100 mil deep, but some of the loams could bite down up to 200, 250 mil deep. That's the key in rehabilitation, is getting water back into the soil and stopping the runoff. That's why this plough was always used in this brickwork system, 10 metres in, 2 metres out to slow down and reduce any runoff. This particular model had a drum roller seed box driven by a land wheel with a series of chains to drive the seed box. But the opposed disc plough basically was the most effective machine for pasture rehabilitation, for hard clay pans, for water penetration. The ripper tine, in this case, is laid right back to aid penetration of the soil. Other forms of the opposed disc plough may not have had the ripper tine on the front. Other models, the seed box themselves were driven by the PTO or by a chain off the back wheel, so a whole host of ideas to drive the seed boxes, a variation of the seed box themselves. We found that the best positioning for the seed was just on the edge of this trench in that loose soil along through there that had better water soakage. Also, as the soil, any plant that established up here was at risk as the soil subsided with its own natural settlement. But even though we had a good seed bed, that was still the optimum place for seed placement. That's why we had the subsequent ploughs had seed boxes with precision seeding sites. The check furrow plough was developed very late in the regeneration era. That's why it's never equipped with seed boxes or anything like that. Designed to intercept maximum water flows, leaves a trench approximately 40 centimetres wide and 100 to 150 mil deep. 3 metres apart are these little walls across the trench. The highlight we've used here emphasises the bank spacing. It's very critical that this plough be used on surveyed contour lines. If you got off course with a contour line, it is possible to channel water flows. So surveying was very critical of this. Slow machine, but tied in with the opposed disc plough or the pitter plough, retained 90% of water flows on a given area, which is the key with rehabilitation works, is getting the water trapped and back into the soils. This particular implement is close to 50 years old, designed to be pulled by a 40 horsepower tractor. You can see the seeding mechanism is driven by a land wheel. Other models were driven by a cog off the tractor wheel or even off the PTO shaft via a car diff to drive the seeding mechanism. The seeding mechanism with a variable rate of flow actually placed the seed via the tubes down here beyond the tines into a loose seed bed. Not big penetration water flows, but primarily designed to just introduce pasture back into bare areas. The pitter plough, or peach pitter plough to give it a correct title, has a eccentric or concentric axle that raises and lowers the plough. The plough worked extremely well in conjunction with the opposed disc plough in the fact that it could cover big areas very quickly and was very simple machine to tow and to operate, in that once it was down, it stayed down. You didn't have to keep lifting up and down. Each tine had its own seed box, and the seed box has been driven by the axle via chains. The seed was placed in and around the pits in the loose disturbed soils or in the pits where the water was going to be concentrated. Each tine, 3 tines, and each tine be in the ground for 2 metres, and as the wheel revolved would lift the plough out for 2 metres. You can see here the highlight we've used. This model pitter plough, depending on the soil types, would work down to 6 to 8 inches or 150, 200 mil deep, and each pit would be approximately 2 metres long. Two versions of the crocodile plough are available, the 3-point linkage single barrel, and the more common was the double-barrelled towed version we're seeing here today. One small advantage with the crocodile plough is that it wasn't essential that you had to follow the contour line, because the impact it had on the soils was relatively minimal. It could bounce over all sorts of obstacles, hand beds, sticks, logs. But then the disadvantage was that on the harder soils, the harder clay pans, there was very small penetrations. On some of the softer loams, it did dig in and up to 50, 75 mil deep, 100 mil deep in some real good soils. The seed was held inside the rollers, the big drums. You could distribute a range of seeds in the one pass, and it's distributed through holes in behind the tines or the paddle wheels, and you could vary the rate of flow of the seed by opening and shutting the little valves over the holes itself, but it did introduce pasture what was otherwise bare ground.
The underlying principle for all soil rehabilitation on hard scolds and clay pans is to retain water and allow infiltration. The most efficient methods are those that leave a wide deep trench, trapping all or most of the water flows and assisting good soakage. This also creates a protective barrier for native and sown seed. As well as holding moisture, this barrier protects seeds by providing lower ground temperatures and a windbreak. These methods are still adhered to today, with the lessons from yesterday providing a good learning curve to work off today. Surveying should be carried out prior to any commencement of work to ensure that the contour line is adhered to. Without correct location of plough lines, misdirected flow can easily turn into an erosion problem. The best establishment site for plants in each cultivation type is also important. If seed is being sowed precisely rather than being broadcast, the establishment site chosen needs to be in the mid-zone between the bottom and top of the pit. This gives seed an opportunity to establish whether the wet season is dry or wet.
Water penetration is the key. That is, that if you get water in and you're sort of lowering the ground temperatures and you're trapping the water, that's it.
There are many techniques for land rehabilitation, including water ponding and deep ripping. Water ponding is an extremely effective technique, but has high installation and high maintenance costs and is impractical for broad-scale pastoralism. Deep ripping has frequently been recommended as a relatively inexpensive technique, but is ineffective in the long term on most soil types.
Everywhere I go, people ask me about deep ripping with tractors and graders. You might as well just bloody go to Bali for a holiday because you're going to achieve the same thing. You might get a good feeling out of it, but because the ripper tine is so narrow, and the first, especially in sodic soils, that they seal off so quickly. You go back after a shower of rain, the top centimetre's damp, but underneath that's dry. The water's just flowing straight across because the disturbance was too narrow to really be effective.
The reality is I've seen ponding banks where the banks are too far apart, the slope is too great, the actual amount of water that builds up is in fact deeper than the bank itself. A piece of the bank breaks, and all of a sudden where you had sheet erosion, you've now got a rill, which becomes a gully. So you can quite easily make things worse.
I think the main thing you've got to think of when you're doing the work with the opposed disc plough is that you've got to be able to isolate the country during the wet, whether you do it by fencing it off or using a one-wire electric fence or something so that you can keep the cattle off it. And then you've got to make sure that you get a theodolite or something like that and mark all the contours before you start.
I'm Alan Andrews. I was a wife Ros. We were 12 years on Uri, arrived in 81 in the northwest, and then we've been 14 years on Avern. We've watched the country go from big open bare flats, clay pans, to a very well grassed and revegetated area. So with our good seasons and our right stocking rates, the control of ferals and the control of stocking rates, with the country's vegetation cover has increased dramatically.
Talking with the manager of a major pastoral company, or general manager of a major pastoral company a few years ago, he had an anecdotal story about a dashwood crossing over the Victoria River. And prior to fencing off the river, it was a standard procedure that every year the does would have to go down and clear the silt off the river crossing, clear the cuttings out and clear the approaches to this causeway. Once the river was fenced off, well, the dozer could be there for a week. By the time he pushed a little bit of silt out, wait for it to dry out a little bit and push out a bit more. And once the river was fenced, that dozer has never been down to that river crossing. It's just a grader, and a grader can do it in a day's work just to clear off the silt. The reduction in silt has been so dramatic since the river levee banks have been fenced off.
The individual pastoralists, they were great, and they were quite supportive, and they were interested in the regen work. Yeah, one of them who we used to play cricket with, and who'd supply us with bread and whatnot and meat when we wanted it, was a bit of a rough diamond from the State Creek station, but he was really interested in the plants that we were using. But I remember he rode into our camp one day and said, well, I've just been riding through that Kelly paddock of yours up there mustering, and see where you've done all that work and all that ploughing and chisel ploughing up there, he said, and sowing. And I actually saw a couple of buffle plants, you know, in the workings. Actually saw a couple. And he said, I got off my horse and I pulled them up. I didn't want to spoil your average.